Panel, as you can see from your handouts, we have a mix of folks, and the one person that is a little bit different in this mix that I want to point out is Jeff Dillon, and he is part of the General Counsel Office for NOAA, because we thought we should have someone from the government talking a little bit about the legal aspects. So as we've done with the other groups, we're just going to kind of ask people to talk about what their impressions are of the path forward, and then we'll get into some questions from the audience. And I know this is going to go over the normal federal time for operations, so I thank you all for saying.
24/7.
Got it. So why don't we start, Justin, you're new up here, so why don't we start with you and Jeff?
So thank you.
And
I
David.
will try 2 ideas and 3 comments. And first, so Justin Kenny with the Pew Travel Trust. But let me say, I'm up here really based on my experience of being a communications director at NOAA during BP. And my comments are my own, so I'll own these. The 2 comments, I think in the next year, and apologies if some of this is underway, and I realize some of this stuff is pretty obvious, but I'll say it anyway. I think there's clearly a need for kind of a Response 101 document that is developed collectively. This would be a great role for SEJ or somebody else that covers the rules, the roles, and the terms in an event like this. At NOAA, yes, sure, we had a great scientific integrity policy. You could call a reporter and talk to them. We get information out when we want to. We're on Twitter, we were on Facebook. But the rules are different when you're in a spill like this. And what are they? They're not clear to me. They're not clear to everybody else. You know, many of us have never been in this situation before. It's all new. We're not all immersed in the Oil Pollution Act stuff. So clearly spelling out what the rules are. I know General Counsel is going to help us do that. What are the rules in there? There's probably a lot of things we're getting wrong, a lot of assumptions we're making that aren't true. What can we say? When can we say it? How can we say it? So again, I think a document that can define what the rules are in these kinds of situations. Secondly, I think a document, these could be chapters of the ones you're working on, that define what the terms are. What is flow rate? What is an oil budget? These things haunt me in my sleep still 5 years later, right? It's all your fault. So, on this stuff, you know, what do these things mean? And put them down and define them and keep them up to date. But what are the terms that we use in these kinds of situations? We forget them, we misuse them, and just the basics. There's probably several dozen that would get us 80% of the way there. And then the roles. Who does what in these situations? NOAA, you know, was in charge of tracking the oil, of sampling seafood to see if it's safe, of doing the weather forecasts, of marine mammals, but not all marine mammals, you know, not all birds. I mean, who does what? What are the roles here? And let's get those clearly defined. And then I think that document in an event, when an event happens, bring that out. Let's all get together and go over it again. Make sure the government understands it, the NGOs understand it, the journalists understand it, all of that. So that's one idea, I think, on having that kind of a document put together. And I think part of that document, too, could include some kind of overriding principles that the government lays out in terms of, this kind of gets to the truth, transparency, access, all those kinds of things. Put that down. What are the government's principles in these kinds of situations? So that's one idea, this idea of like a Response 101 document that we could use for communications. And then the second one, I think, is just taking a look at the JIC and just kind of, I know you're doing that, but kind of modernizing the JIC to reflect the realities. We talked a lot about social media that journalists use, that governments use. I mean, look at what's happening with the use of smartphones in the police force. It's changing everything. You got citizen journalism is going to be happening on this thing. Next time this thing happens, there's going to be all kinds of images coming from all over the place. Seth can't get access to that beach, but you can bet other people can get access to that beach. They're just going to climb over the fence and go there. They're going to be taking pictures and they're going to be sending it out. So this is the reality we're working in. So how do we modernize to keep up with that? A couple ideas on the JIC. I don't know how well we use pool reporting before. I think we could make more access of having pool reporters, potentially pool reporters at the JIC or in other key places that we could use. And then this idea of an ombudsman. It's kind of like Thad Allen saying, here's my cell phone, call anytime. Could SEJ place somebody whose full-time job is to be the ombudsman? And that's the person that the media can call to get something resolved at the JIC, for example. Those are a couple of thoughts or two thoughts on that. And then three, just quick observations. Speaking with one voice is great, but man, yes, there are times when I want to hear from Admiral Allen, but there are so many more times where I want to hear from the person who just came off the water and that turtle expert and all that kind of stuff. We've got to find the right balance between one voice and then all the other hardworking, great people who are doing important jobs that lend themselves beautifully to stories and build trust with the public, I think. You got to keep access open to those people. Sharing data, you just got to do it. You got to do it faster, quicker, put it up, do the analysis later, whatever. You got to get that data out. And then explaining uncertainty, I've commented on that before. I think it's such a tricky thing to do, but we've got to find a better way in the moment to try to explain uncertainty before you get tripped over things like flow rate, oil budgets, or nasty things. So that's my comments. Thank you.
David?
So I'm with the Center for Public Integrity. This is where. No. Can you hear me? No. Okay, there we go. I feel a little bit like I was invited to the wrong event because I've never covered an environmental disaster, and I don't write stories every day. I can spend sometimes weeks or months on a story. But as I was listening to today's session, I was thinking I do have a perspective that hasn't been presented yet, and that is I have substantial experience working with the public relations people at the EPA. And in listening today, I hear that maybe NOAA is itself a model for how to do this. And in this plan where you're coming up with a unified approach, you may be strapping yourself to somebody that is the opposite of a model of how to do this, because my experience with the EPA has been incredibly frustrating. And I'll give you some examples of that. I'll give you some concrete examples of that. So I worked with the PBS NewsHour to do a story on some problems that the EPA was having with conflicts of interest on peer review panels. What they were doing is they were hiring peer review panels through a contractor, and it turns out that some of these peer reviewers had very substantial conflicts of interest. So one of them had to do with hexavalent chromium, which is the chemical from the Aaron Brockovich movie. So in our attempts to pursue this story, we managed to, of course, interview Aaron Brockovich. We interviewed a scientist from the American Chemistry Council and a lawyer from the American Chemistry Council. We interviewed a corporate executive at PG&E, which was actually at that time paying one of the peer reviewers $100,000, and that was part of the conflict. And we interviewed one of the peer reviewers. The only people that we could not interview for this story was the EPA. They waited months to even respond, and they kept asking us, "What's your deadline? What's your deadline? Here's our drop dead deadline." And then they'd go past that, and they said, "Well, what's your real drop dead deadline?" And then finally, they finally granted, like probably 2 days before the story aired, they gave us like a 10-minute phone interview with the speakerphone. I mean, this was way too late to be on television. So, I mean, it made maybe a comment or two made the print version of the story. But it was really terrible. There was another situation where I was doing a story with public radio, and I needed to talk to somebody, very simple questions, who was the head of a research agency. And he was there testifying before Congress. So he was there to answer questions to members of Congress. And so I approached him in the hallway a couple of times, and literally the public relations people from the EPA literally physically blocked me twice. got between me and the guy and said basically, and I'd been trying to get an interview with this guy for months, and they said, well, you're gonna have to go through the channels, you can't talk to him now. So, I don't know what's going on at the EPA, but I do know that it didn't used to be that way, because I've talked to people in previous administrations who worked at the EPA who are shocked when I tell them how bad it is today. So one of the things I understand is going on is that I used to think that people who were in communications working in a particular department reported to the heads of those departments. It turns out that they're actually apparently the bosses, because even if somebody at a high level wants to talk to me, they don't have permission to talk to me. In fact, nobody in the EPA has permission to talk to me. When I talk to sources, they can call up the EPA and talk to whoever they want. Presumably my next door neighbor could call up somebody at the EPA and talk to them, but as a member of the press, I'm not allowed to talk to anybody. So this apparently is all being channeled through the White House. So the White House makes the decision as to what information I'm going to get as a reporter. This is what when I see this unified plan, I'm thinking, why would you do that? I mean, if you've got a system, if you guys are already doing it right, why do you want to like hook up with somebody who's doing it wrong? And I guess that's my observation.
Okay, so Dana, I really think we should have you speak now, because I want to make sure EPA gets to say something.
So, as the only rep here from EPA that has no experience in public affairs, I'm gonna do my best. The Office of Public Affairs does have procedures that we need to follow. There is a crisis communication plan. I'm not aware of things going through the White House or being approved or anything like that. I've never heard of that. I mean, if you're in a big response, like Deepwater Horizon, yes, everyone's involved. The president's involved. The cabinet's involved. So I'm not aware of that. So the only thing I can do is take back some of these stories and relay them to my Office of Public Affairs. I think I've got some pretty good, solid examples here. And bring it up and raise it to them and raise the concerns and let folks know of the concern and the issues that are being brought up. It's the best I can do. I'm emergency response, I'm emergency management, I am writing all this down and taking it very seriously, and I'll provide the feedback. It's the only thing I can do at this point without having the Yeah, we are part of the communications plan of all the agencies, and our public affairs office has worked with the other folks. Now, we are a regulatory agency, which does put us in a little bit of a different position. But regardless, we do like to think of ourselves as a transparent. I'm out there noting that on a regular basis. You heard me during the first panel how important it is for me to be getting that data up. I have personally been involved in posting over 1 million data points in my career at EPA. So from emergency response perspective, from my world and what I know, I can tell you we take it seriously. We want to get the information out there. But I've heard it from more than one source, and as I said, we are playing, we are part of it, we are public affairs, people are involved. But I'll bring these stories back. It's the best I can do at this point. I think they'll be having future meetings. I can see if folks from that office would be willing to come and to explain it, and I'll look further into it. So it's the best I can do. Thank you.
And if I could comment for just 1 second. Aside from the anecdotes about access at the EPA, your question as to why the plan reflects an association with the EPA or a joining of the EPA. The plan reflects the roles that are written out in statute. And so the Coast Guard has certain responsibilities that are statutorily mandated, and so does EPA, so does NOAA. And the amount of wiggle room or who we choose to partner with is not really it's not up to us. It's kind of directed to us by the law. And then the kind of political overtones of how transparent or how forthcoming an agency is or how well it's managed, we leave that to others to decide and to debate. But the primary responsibility of federal agencies is to follow the laws that are passed and to implement those laws. And so we have very little wiggle room. So the plan reflects the fact that inland oil spill or inland chemical disaster is, the lead federal agency is EPA. An oil spill or chemical disaster in the jurisdiction of the Coast Guard, basically coastal or intercoastal waterways, those are the navigable waterways, that's the responsibility of the Coast Guard. And there's very little we can do for that. And if I could just sort of segue into my one comment as far as going forward, the dialogue where you would like us to listen, respond more quickly, we understand that. We're constantly working with that tension. Kind of on our wish list is an item that alludes and kind of aligns with what I was just mentioning. Greater knowledge of reporters coming to a disaster of the laws that direct our activity, the laws that bring the responsible party into it, and how these mechanisms are instructed for us to operate. We would ask for a way to get into a better dialogue so we can have a better mutual understanding of the things that drive our response time, but also that drive our structures and clearance mechanisms. So that's kind of my wish, my Christmas wish for the way forward that would be on it.
And it may be that, David, you were dealing with people different than OEM, than the Office of Emergency Management. I'm guessing, I'm not sure.
That's true, although I think you're all part of this Office of Public Relations, right?
No, I'm not, it's a separate AH.
Okay,
I'm
all right.
emergency response. But that doesn't, I'm still, one of 14,000 employees, so I will bring it back it is a separate group.
So I'm Jeff Dillon. I'm Jeff Dillon. I'm from NOAA Office of General Counsel, Sole Attorney now. And I'm here to talk about the legal sideboards that can somehow affect the flow of information from the government to the public. We've already touched on it a little bit in some of the other panels. I guess the court case preparations was mentioned as one way that information might not be disclosed to the public, and there's other, privacy information and business confidential information and personnel information that is not disclosed. But for the most part, I don't think legal considerations need to come deeply into the flow of information. And when I look at the flow of information, I look at through the lens of the hallmark statute, the Freedom of Information Act, which happens to be a really useful act for getting government information to the public. Sadly, not really useful on the timelines that we've been talking about today. There are deadlines in it, but they're weeks and months, as opposed to minutes and hours. And we're routinely stretched. And the point I'd like to make about the Freedom of Information Act is we can make it better. And since it's looking ahead, from the government side, for an event that's interesting. A lot of people are interested, and it's not just me that gives us FOIA requests, it's the public, and we get dozens, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of requests, all of which we have to respond to in the word received. And they aren't really limited as to scope, so they can say, tell us everything you know about oil spills, and we got to respond. And so it could be an egregious resource draw for us. But frankly, we could get better at it, because if you knew ahead of time what people were going to be interested in and it's disclosable, we could just post it. We don't have to wait for a request. And I think the agencies are getting better at doing that. They're setting up sort of data warehouses where they know, like for an oil spill, they're going to be interested in certain types of data. It's disclosable. Why wait? Put it up. And then guess what? We avoided a 10,000 request for that piece of data. It's out there and everybody can just look at the website. But on the requester side, and I heard some frustration on the requester side, my advice would be there are statutory deadlines and the like. Don't rely on the defaults. I mean, FOIA is a person on the other end of the line. Every agency has a FOIA officer. You put in your request, you should get a notice that it was received, and then call the person up. And here's the problem that often is, I find, is that there's ways you can expedite by saying, look, I need A immediately, but I could wait on B and C. So if it can be teased apart, that's fine. I think when we have real problems, when there are broad requests, and some of the stuff that's non-disclosable is mixed in with a vast body of disclosable information, and then some soul, sometimes me, has to go through page by page and line by line to tease out what can't be disclosed, and it takes a lot of time. But frankly, I think most requesters have some very specific documents they want in mind right away, and you can just ask for them. Just don't wait 20 days to get a response. Call them up and say, look, I need X immediately. And then if you're unpleased with what you get, or when you get it, don't wait. I remember in the first panel, Mark said, you know, if a reporter gets it wrong, don't wait. Call them up. Tell them. It's not self-correcting. Make them do it. And if they don't give you relief, go up. Go over to the publisher if you need to. Well, I'm telling you the same thing. Because if you don't like the response you get, guess what? One good thing about FOIA is it's got tons of remedies, which is appeal the scope of the search. You don't like that? Appeal the fees determination if you don't like that. Appeal the documents that they didn't disclose. I mean, the government, you know, makes non-disclosure calls. Some of them we don't have, they're not discretionary. We can't disclose personal privacy information because that's not our privilege. But a lot of it's discretionary. So, no, and put us to the test, because it's our burden to show that there's foreseeable harm to the public in withholding these documents where it's discretionary, we could disclose them. So put it in there, put your case in, and then take it up. Take it out of the person's hands that's actually got the document in their hand and go above us, because for the NOAA, the appeals go to the Department of Commerce. That's outside of our shop. We didn't know those people. They sit and they make the determination based on the law, based on these arguments. You may look, I need to disclose this. And if you don't like the answer you get from the Department of Commerce, take it to court. Frankly, I heard a few of these 4-year, 5-year FOIA requests. You don't get them in 4 or 5 years. I mean, your rightness claim for bringing the suit if you need to for timeliness is much before that. And so put us to the test. I mean, really, we enforce the timelines. I wasn't saying rely, the way to speed it up is not to rely on that. Try to speed it up, make the relationship, make the call, try to get the information you need when you need it. If it doesn't work, avoid it when you can, use it when you must. Use all the remedies that are available to you and get the satisfaction that you need.
Okay, I think I've gotten all the new people. No, Tim, you are on another panel. So I just want to, yep. Okay, now we're going to go through. Yes. These 3 folks were new to any panel, so go ahead. Oh,
You're gradually dying out here. I think you're talking too much. All right. So, I mean, I think we're getting down to sort of the nitty-gritty. And one thing I'll start out by saying is I think, speaking on behalf of SEJ, I think we stand ready to talk with you about ways to make this a more open and public-friendly communication strategy. One thing that I think would stand in very good stead right up front, you don't have to add a chapter. It's right at the very top, statement of intent. That this strategy is intended to be as open and prompt and truthful, if you want to use that word, Seth, as is legally possible. We'll give the caveat to the lawyer. You said there really wasn't that much that you have to withhold, okay? So you made it. Yeah. So, I mean, if you make that clear at the outset, that's what's supposed to be the guiding principle of everything else that follows. And hopefully the people will actually notice that when they apply this. I think the other thing we have to think about is, that, you know, we got to get out of our silos, whatever they call it these days anymore, and stop thinking about our roles as they used to be. We journalists are that way, you are too. When we get into these situations with access, maybe it is dangerous to get close to that burning fire. Maybe it's dangerous to be on that beach. There are other ways to do it. Pool reporting. You know, I mentioned drones before. I mean, that's one way you can get somebody in there without anybody being physically at risk. So think about ways to make it happen instead of why it can't or why it hasn't been done before. Because really, again, the public is demanding the answers. We're simply reflecting their anxiety and their demands for information. And so I think that's really key. The other thing is, you know, this is all about a communication strategy for crisis, when obviously things are everybody wants everything right away. But this goes back to that point before, that there's decent communication going on pre-crisis. That will help tremendously. And that's part of what you hear, the frustration reflecting here is that, you know, day to day we have trouble getting information out of government now. And under a crisis situation, it's just magnified. So the more that can be broken down and dealt with, the better it's going to be overall. In terms of helping people understand what the Oil Pollution Control Act is all about and what your spill response capabilities are, you can go out, reach out, invite the media, to come witness your capabilities, Coast Guard, EPA. I know they have these disaster drills. We usually skip them because they're really dull. But if you have them, you know, there's an opportunity there. At the very least, give people the chance to come out and find out. Put it on the website. Show a YouTube video of how it works. All right? And so those are all ways to deal with this stuff. There's a jillion other ideas we can talk about, but I think the point is that, you know, there's a lot that can be done if we just make up our minds to do it.
I have to say a couple of things.
There's one.
Does that work? Yeah. First of all, I do, all kidding aside, I do want to thank everyone for their candor because, you know, it's hard to get us all together. We're all busy, we're all 24/7, and it helps us. So as hard as it is to hear, it's good. And it gives us ideas, and I think all the ideas I've heard actually I think are really good today. We do need to work on the guidance. We do need to explain the role of the PRP. We do need to explain roles and responsibilities. It's murky at times, even for us. What's the difference between USDA and FDA? You know, there's a pizza analogy out there. I won't go into it with you, but it's hard to understand, and EPA has a role too. So we do need to explain that better. We get caught up in our own ways because it's natural for us. We don't think about it as much. So I agree with that. I think we've got some really good ideas here. I totally agree with the social media. For me, it was news. You can go back to people and say, hey, fix this, because it's not what we're traditionally used to, and I think some of us may be caught, some of us are aging ourselves. But there's a lot of capability in social media here, and I think we could really figure out how to use it for all of us to move forward. You know, even things like, you know, reporting a spill, those type of things. There's just so much out there that we can do. I agree we need to get you guys access to sites and visiting the sites, and we need to figure out a mechanism to do that. I mean, DOD does it during the war. I think we can figure out how to do it during response. So, and we're probably less dangerous. So, I think these are really good ideas. I think it's, as always, trying to make it happen and figure out how to integrate it and get some more of these answers and ideas. So that's really the gist of what I wanted to say. I think we've got a lot here to work with, and we'll go forward on that.
Okay, we're good? All right. So I will be quick. Justin, you know better than that. So I'm just going to make a few quick points. Thanks to Debbie, who took pages of notes up here on things that we should be thinking about. But it all boils down to what can we do to improve the document and the first panel. And a lot of that, you know, as I'm sitting here reflecting, is it won't be the end-all, do-all. We should equally explain what that document isn't going to do. And if we need a companion piece or something that more talks about more tactical communications than strategic or how the government's going to organize, I think they're both important, but we should be thinking about that. I think there's a number of things, good ideas that came out of the social media one, and I think our challenge is how do we, as our agency, how do we as Unified Command right-size that along with everybody else who's going to be responding. But I also think that, you know, as I look at myself, saying what can my office be doing better to engage with, you know, the group that's up here. You know, we did this is a great panel, but if this is all it is, it's better than what we've done previously. But I think we're missing something if we don't do a little bit more in the future. And if I can be more engaged with SEJ and the others, likewise, you know, there were some comments of what journalists could possibly do. I'll just recall a quick story when I was in Charleston and FOSC. We did do area planning. It was hard to get journalists out to be part of the area planning committee. It was hard to get them out for exercises, but I was able to get at least one of the local journalists, and I had the same thing in Toledo, to say, okay, I don't need you for the whole exercise, but would you be willing to either by phone or in person come out and just do sort of a mock interview, not a hard, what are those questions that you would need answered? And our staff learned an awful lot about what those driving questions were that they thought, based on the scenario, the public would want to know. Some of which we anticipated, but some we didn't. And to think that internally we know all the answers was an eye-opener for us as to some of the things that they thought were important, and we're like, okay. And then when a real event happened, we were much better prepared. So I think those are some opportunities as we go forward to look, this group, maybe even larger group of what we could do better. And then lastly, I'll say, we can even do it internally. One of the challenges is, and Justin will tell you this, prior to Deepwater, he came to our office and says, so what's all this oil spill response stuff? And he remembers that conversation because he knew yeah, he didn't really know, well, he did. He really wanted to spend the time to learn. I mean, this was before Deepwater. About 3 weeks before. Well, premonition or not, I don't know, maybe he was part of the conspiracy there, what he talked about. But in any case, that is, as leadership within organizations change, as people change, and we've got a wealth of experience, maybe just briefly from Deepwater Horizon, but there may not be another big event for some time. And how do we keep training even our internally people so that when the event happens, we can do it seamlessly, let alone government-wide. So I'll leave it with that.
Just again, I think that, I'm a big fan of the show Veep. And when I hear talk about messaging, I think of the characters in Veep who spend all their time trying to make sure that the message is right. And there'll be, I've been a reporter longer than you might think, and there was a time when it was when the messaging wasn't so, hadn't become the science that it is today. And I think that just making people accessible, like somebody raised the question, a lot of times we don't know the answer, just being honest, saying we don't know. I would actually say that different agencies, you shouldn't be afraid to have contradictory information because you're going to have it anyway. And just everybody doing their best is really a good strategy. I think that actually, from a reporter's standpoint, honesty is easily the best approach.
Okay, so I think we'll open this up. Kathy, are you ready to, perfect, go out for some questions or comments? Mark is right there.
Okay, so I have to tell you the rest of the story about the FOI request. And to place it in the proper context, to begin with, I was told I would have to file an FOI request to get the information. That's number one, so that's the starting point. The other piece of that, unfortunately, is that we were not in a position to go through the process of following up as easily as you would normally do it in the course of business. I had no place to live for 6 months. My newspaper had no place to work for multiple weeks. Our attorneys were out of homes. Our other reporters were out of homes. And we needed that information immediately, not in weeks or even in the 20 days that are part of the law. The public wanted to know right then, as you saw from my file, 72 million people were following us online the week after the storm. So that information was important to the public. And the documents I was asking for were those initial response surveys that were done by FEMA. So that's the rest of the story. But I also want to place it into a bit different perspective, and that is, let me read this to you. Hold on a second here. Information maintained by the federal government is a national asset. My administration will take appropriate action consistent with law and policy to disclose information rapidly in forms that the public can readily find and use. Executive departments and agencies should harness new technologies to put information about their operations and decisions online and readily available to the public. Executive departments and agencies should also solicit public feedback to identify information of greatest use to the public. That's all from the President's transparency executive order. I think that's fairly clear, or at least I thought it was fairly clear. But in the last couple of years, it doesn't seem to have been as clear to the federal agencies that it applies to. Just leave it at that.
Anybody want to respond to that?
I'll try.
Oops.
That's why I think adding that kind of opening chapter to the communication document, wherein it lays out its principles, as Tim has mentioned and others have mentioned, about this document adheres to the following principles: openness, access, transparency, honesty, all that. Put it in there. That lives beyond any administration or beyond any political appointee, beyond anybody who's working in there.
Go ahead.
I think Debbie Payton's point earlier about the technology challenge, and honestly, when the transparency statement was put out, everybody agrees with transparency. It's a goal, it's an objective, because we are paid by the taxpayer to do our job. We work for the taxpayer, we work for the American people. The challenge I think we're running into is the technology investment you have to make. And I look at the National Response Center, which as EPA's budget gets decreased and NOAA's budget gets decreased, they're chipping in, and but that doesn't mean we should just hide behind, so we have decreasing budgets, constrained resources. I think the challenge for us leaving here today is how do we break through that? How do we, because it's transformational. If we can get this right, this access piece, this digital piece, this making things available as much as possible, I think you made the point, then I don't have to go through a million FOIAs. It's there, you point it to the website. Believe it or not, when we did the B-120 spill in Buzzards Bay that I led, and when we did Deepwater Horizon, we actually had websites. The goal in the first days was push everything out that you can. Get it on a website, give people access to information. We did get, the New York Times did herald us with a good job of our website, but and EPA was doing the data for the water and air quality and increased the frequency and put it on a website. I still think scales go, even though we tried, it's glass half full or glass half empty. We got to do better, and your input today has been extremely helpful, because when we go back to focus on rewriting this document and the work we're going to do, we're going to focus on part of the discussion in this room today for where let's prioritize where we're going to put our attention, and some of it is based on your feedback, and that was the whole goal and objective. So thanks for that.
I think there's one thing no one's really talked about here, which is a cultural thing in terms of agencies. There are some agencies that by culture are very media friendly and adaptable because they view themselves as science agencies, NOAA, NASA, USGS. Others are not just not just neutral, but media antagonistic. And the trouble is you've got both in there. EPA, nothing personal, Coast Guard. It's not just a neutral thing, it's an antagonistic thing.
Yeah, so I am the public affairs chief of the Coast Guard, and I think I'm reviewing the...
Wait, hold on, stop. It's a perception, you're hearing it, and so we can work together past, okay?
That's what's my point. It's a cultural perception. And I think perhaps the biggest, of all the things I heard, the best thing that might be the most useful, given all these cultural issues, is one of Justin's suggestions, which is the ombudsman, especially one that is not connected to a single agency. Maybe someone who you have on a retainer disaster, you activate that retainer, like a disaster communication firm, but not necessarily that. Or someone who can go in there and do that, because to be honest, there are issues, and it's less so with Coast Guard than EPA, but EPA and SEJ right now are at best at war. Used to be EPA would come, even in the Bush administration, Mike Levitt, Christy Todd Whitman would come to our conventions. Now we can't even get a PR person. EPA is the most
Okay, we've gotten that idea here. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me add one just kind of question to that ombudsman. Would it be appropriate, or would there be a perception of impropriety or ethical dilemma if that particular person, a journalist per se, was embedded in the unified command but paid for by either the responsible party because they're going to
I don't
reimburse
think
it.
you can pay for by the RP based on the law. That's, because we even tried to expand the media.
Well, remember what I'm saying, it's not the role of the journalist,
Right.
but the role of the coordinator as the ombudsman.
Yeah.
Would a journalist be able to then take themselves out of their position and be sort of that coordinator? Because if they were on retainer, they're going to get paid either by contract by the government or contract by reimbursement.
Okay, hold on. Let's give this, Seth, we need to give that back to you, okay?
Because, to be honest, the one part I don't think you can do it with a journalist, maybe an ex-journalist, a retired journalist, or to be honest, Justin.
Okay, Mark wants to
If
say.
I could just
Go ahead,
one
go ahead.
comment. If I could, just for a second. So kind of responding to both your comments, the comment about the statement about the transparency, executive order, and the adversarial relationship. As I mentioned before, the Coast Guard's ethos, maximum disclosure, minimum delay, and if you own it, you can talk about it. And most of that is kind of aligns with the basic fundamentals of journalism. If you want to know what, when, where, all those questions, you can find those pretty easily on our websites or pretty easily from asking somebody. Part of the disconnect or part of the distance between federal agencies and the media is a lot of the stories that are interpretive or editorial, but try to explain the why. And if you ask a why question, there are a lot fewer people in organizations that can answer why questions than there can answer what questions, for various purposes, for various reasons. So when you ask those why questions, a lot more of the questions we get are hypothetical or why. You can anticipate a higher level of organizational response to that, even up in, above the agency level, because those are the why is not part of what we're responsible for. So I just wanted to kind of make that one point there, that a lot of as Ms. Landry said, there were hundreds of thousands of pages of data information for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, number of soiled birds, the number of wildlife that we covered, all the data tests, all of the dispersant tests, all of that was available online. There was overabundance of information, if you ask me, online. Like hard to sort through all of that to get to the piece that you wanted to, but it was our responsibility to put it out online, and we put it out online as soon as we had it. The why was there a decision between dispersants versus burning? That question didn't get online, and you had to get to the right person to answer that question, because that was a decision made sometimes at higher levels of government than even at the UAC. So just appreciate that nuance when you're coming to an agency, if you're asking editorial questions of where you're going to get the answer.
Okay, Mark, and then.
Yeah, real quick, in terms of your question about the ombudsman, there's an agency already stood up to do that. It's at the National Archives, the office that's acting as ombudsman on the FOIA. And I would say you do not want a reporter in that position. You want someone who's a professional at being that kind of a person, being able to go through both sides.
Okay, I know you want to ask a question, right? Or make a comment. Yep, you're right.
Joe. Okay.
I'm sorry, could you just tell me your name?
Joe Davis,
Joe.
SCJ.
Okay.
Preamble. I don't think there's a person in this room who's motivated primarily by politics. Or if there is, I don't know who they are. But I think when things go wrong between journalists and an agency, as Seth is mentioning, that there's politics there. And I understand enough to know that the main purpose for this defensive crouch that agencies have is the desire to avoid political disaster. We're talking about environmental disasters. We're having one right now.
Actually, I'm supposed to be announcing that please use caution. There's a tornado watch through 8 p.m. this evening for the Capital Region. I'm sorry.
Well, I can clarify what that means. If anybody needs to be careful going home. It just, there's potential for tornadoes. It's going to rain for the next 45 minutes. Be careful.
So you can stay here and continue the discussion. Go ahead, Joe. Joe, go ahead.
So I think the agencies are often motivated to avoid political disaster, and I think also that may be one of the motives behind the one voice doctrine. I'm not criticizing it. So I think my key point that I want to make is it's often more of a political disaster when you try to lock down the message and hold things back, and that if you really want to avoid political disaster or credit upon the administration or whatever it is, that openness is a very good way to do that. It wasn't Watergate, it was the cover-up. So I think something to think about. I know how agencies work, I know how interagency panels work, and I think we all here want the same thing, so that's all I've got.
Okay, Mary
We
wants to-
really cannot leave this room thinking that the unified voice is a political agenda. It's really about inconsistency in information that might be from agency to agency, both with authorities, both with expertise, both with responsibilities. And if you have, like for instance, let me give you an example. When some of the real high-level remarks began in the Gulf, a man committed suicide, okay? Because he didn't think he'd ever be able to commercially fish again. He had just heavily invested in a business. So if you have alarmist reports going out in the beginning from anywhere, one agency, gets really concerned about certain things because it's their statutory responsibility, whether it's fisheries, whales, whoever. The unified voice, really the goal and objective, I can't tell you enough, and maybe we'll have to change the wording, but it's not about the politics. It's not, these are all career people that are working on this document, that have been in this business for years, that have statutory responsibilities based on the laws of the United States, so it is not political. I know it sounds like a control. Somebody mentioned on our pre-brief, why are you trying to control? And I said, this isn't control, this is alignment. And there's a huge difference between controlling and aligning, and the goal and objective really is so that we don't have misinformation out there that people, somebody gets hurt. I was worried about civil unrest. I was worried about a lot of things going on in the Gulf that were, I'll give you a quote. So Governor Chris says to me, as I met him in August, I said, Governor, I want to thank you for being a team player in this response. This was really challenging for all the Gulf Coast states. He goes, oh yeah, Mary, that meeting in May, that was a tough meeting. A lot of that was some politics. I said, Governor, I am not naive to politics. I said, I was worried about civil unrest. If you recall, it was June 1st. We didn't have a captain stack and we were going into hurricane season. And those were the real concerns I had at that time. It had nothing to do with the politics and everything to do with serious civil unrest. And so maybe, am I exaggerating that? No, that's where I was coming from. So when we talk about a unified voice, can I just emphasize, it really is about statutory responsibilities, Department of Interior, Department of Defense, support to civil authorities, EPA, NOAA, Coast Guard, Health and Human Services, OSHA, I can go on and on, state responsibility, state jurisdiction, I can go on and on about everybody that's got equities in this. And they all have equities and authorities, and that's why this unified voice message is in there. It really has everything to do with that. I can't emphasize that enough.
Mary, I'm just going to throw again my little teacher hat out there. I don't think you're giving an example of what you mean. I mean, you did talk about a man committing suicide. I'm not saying that. But what do you mean by what you're saying? Speaking with a unified voice, what does that mean?
It means that if...
give examples.
Well, the science of the seafood safety.
Okay.
And so commerce is closing the fisheries across the Gulf. And I don't mean to put this is not to put any agency on the spot, but to speak about seafood safety and to have folks from federal agencies who have responsibilities, for instance, for species that were at risk. Here they are sitting here saying these species might not survive, And then we have FDA saying, look, this seafood is tested. It's safe to eat. You know, can you trust us on that? So that could be messaging that's confusing to the public. Or you have the state, you know, saying, come out and eat the seafood, and then saying at the same day, I've got oil all over the place, and I need more money for response assets and things like that. So those are not the best examples. I think Freedom was a great example. The Freedom spill was a great example where we had one agency saying something about the risk and another agency saying something else about the risk of the water. Those are the kinds of examples that I'm talking about. Just agencies with responsibilities who report something, and then another agency with that same responsibility who might be modeling differently, who might be using a different modeling tool, who might be using different scientific reports that they form their basis on. And then it has that, you know, how do we work behind the scenes to make sure we talk to each other about, you know, what do your models say, what do my models say, and how do we decide what the truth is here? So I think those are examples.
Can I
I guess the one thing I would try to respond to that is that when you have inconsistent information, agencies disagreeing, experts disagreeing, I think it's imperative that you not bury that information until you can reach an agreement. Let people know there's a disagreement. Let them know that you're trying to get to the bottom of it. And for the time being, we just don't know fully what the answer is.
And I did take that away as a good point today that some of you made. If you have inconsistent information, go ahead and go out and say it. You know, NOAA uses this model and this is what it says. EPA uses this and this is what it says. I think that's a great point that I wrote down that we might be able to want to get comfortable with, you know, and figure out a way to say, okay, we're going to agree to disagree. And, you know, but the challenge is the public's going to look for an answer, and they're going to want to know who to respond to. And so if we come out there with two different answers as a federal government, I think the public will come back with that and say, well, you know, what do I do? You're telling me this and you're telling me this. Well, what am I supposed to do?
But so what if there isn't like a clear answer? You might have disagreement between one agency and another, and there might be different answers to the fish question. So doesn't it make more sense for the public to know both versions rather than to have sort of some kind of meeting of the minds?
But if we can work ahead of time to understand, and part of this work and this response is to get to know each other ahead of time, find out, oh, you're using a different modeling tool than I am. Maybe we can have a work group and come to terms with how we could align our modeling, not to take away from anybody's integrity as a scientist or any agency's integrity on what they rely on. This is the work of alignment in figuring out ahead of time. You know, why do you have a different modeling tool than me, and how might we get our scientists together, you know, ahead of time? I mean, so that kind of work is going on, and that's where we're coming from this. If you don't even have that, if we didn't have that document to pass around to everybody, they wouldn't even be looking at this and thinking about it and talking about it. So part of that draft was to get everybody starting to talk about, here's your authorities, here's your responsibilities, how do we work together to have unified and alignment, you know, not control, yeah.
And unfortunately, our experience at Deepwater Horizon doesn't give us a lot of hope for appreciation of nuance in these incidences. So, or some considered, considered weighing of alternatives or conflicting information, and especially on social media. We can put those things on websites for long review, but they don't get a ton of long review. So we're faced with the reality of a media or of a populace that wants, especially in crises, wants a certain answer, wants to know that the government knows what's going on, has a plan to address it. That's what they want. We don't always know the right answer, but there's our experience has been there's little appreciation on the government side for, well, here's one hand, here's the other hand, help us figure it out. That doesn't play well. There are many forces that pull at that don't allow it to play well, but kind of that's the reality.
Okay, so I'm cognizant of the time here, and we have managed to go through 3 panels and 3 hours of discussion on this, and when the center envisioned this conversation, we never envisioned that it would end in 3 hours. Nothing we do ends in 3 hours. I can tell you that Dave gave us this job of getting all the scientists that we know together to discuss dispersants and what's known and what's uncertain about dispersants. At last check, we had 20 hours plus for each panel on 5 topics of dispersants that we've been going through. So, and we aren't even close. So it's going to take a lot of discussion here for this topic as well. So this is the beginning, and it sounds like we have the makings of a longer-term discussion. So. The second part of what?
After we get all the scientists.
Oh, the second part of the discussion on dispersants.
Yeah,
You mean
so-
that'll happen
so-
4 years from now?
No, better not. So, no, but that's exactly what the workshop was going to be divided into 2 sections. The first section was to bring the science together, not to discuss the policy of dispersants or the use or non-use, but look at the scientific information that was being printed, and this was specific to the Arctic, of saying, what do we know, what don't we know, can we agree upon this science would be applicable to this situation, or it wouldn't be. Not applicable. It's not saying it's bad science. Some of it may be bad, some of it might not be. But what would be the applicable science that has been published about dispersants that would be useful for making determinations from a scientific point of view, that this was good science. Now that ultimately can factor into Coast Guard EPA policy, but that wasn't the intention of the scientists getting together. But the second piece of that is then we're going to bring some of those same scientists and journalists together and say, okay, this is what we know. How do we communicate that information? How do we let so we're not at 2 extremes that it's not bad or it's terrifying, that we would be able to utilize it as a tool when it's appropriate to use as a tool. How do you communicate that information in science? That was really one of the challenges during Deepwater. It's still a challenge today. So there's information out there on the efficacy of it, the effectiveness of it. There's information out there on the toxicity. So when you're making those decisions, how do we communicate that which we know, and how do we separate that from some information that's been published that really wouldn't be applicable because, for example, it was done in a testing environment that didn't mimic or wouldn't mimic real-world conditions up there. So I just point that out because some of you may actually be called upon for that piece from Nancy to say, okay, now we're going to have a discussion to say, how would we do that? How should we get that information out to the public? And that's our ultimate goal. So is that did I capture
It's a
that?
better example, but I didn't want to bring up dispersants, but you brought it up.
Well, no, but it's a good
No,
example.
it's a good example of the kind of work we're doing.
And to communicate and say, just because we're using it for this particular environment and these conditions, doesn't mean that isn't totally applicable to everywhere. So that gets us that first step forward. And Nancy, to her credit, has done a marvelous job. And it wasn't just dispersants. You looked at some other capabilities, but the panels would look maybe at a dozen papers and winnow that down.
500 papers.
No, for a particular issue, winnow that down to just a handful that might be applicable. So give us.
Well, there's a lot more papers than that, but that's okay, Dave.
No, I know.
Okay.
There's hundreds.
Yeah, 500 and counting. Okay, so what I want to do here is I will give everybody, and I'm literally taking this time, Seth, 1 minute to give their summary comments, if you would like.
30 seconds.
Go.
Wait. I think a couple truths. I think it's always going to be an adversarial relationship. I think we just have to accept that and work with that. I think the idea that you can control the message, if it was ever true, it sure as heck isn't true today. So let's just focus on what you can do. And I want to thank the Coast Guard and everybody involved with this paper. I think sharing it with us is awesome. I think we have a chance to rewrite into this the culture, the principles, the priorities, how we're going to work together through this and the next time this happens. I think it's great, happy to be part of more of this and trying to think that through. So thank you.
That was very good. That was 40 seconds. Okay. Anyone else want to say anything? Dana? Okay.
When in doubt, get it out. All right? I think the idea, put as much out there as possible. I do think you need to answer questions, though. I mean, I think that's the problem, is that you can bury us in data and people can misinterpret it, pick only a piece of it. But we need to be able to ask and answer questions.
Yeah, so mine is just two simple questions, and that is, when I think back of all the good things we did today, I think who should have been here that wasn't on both the journalist side and on government or other entities, maybe other agencies to do this as we move forward. And secondly, what didn't we talk about that we should have? We thought we did a pretty good panel in 3 hours, but those are the things that moving forward we may be able to move to that next discussion.
I guess mine is just, it's easy to overthink something like this, and I think that it may not be as complicated as what we've been talking about today. It's just really a question of doing the right thing, giving access, and being honest.
I wanted to echo, I think it was Captain's earlier comments about expectations that, and it could be 5, 10, 15 years. We have another disaster like here, or never. So our interest might wane after the 5-year anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill goes. But this document is intended to help us establish expectations, and because one of these spills is about expectation management, both on our sides and on your sides, and helping us let the public know what's going to happen. And so I hope that we can accomplish this with this document, so that people kind of know what to expect, know what to anticipate, where to go for information, and how it's going to work, because that was really the biggest problem in one of these things.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, so a couple of closing remarks. First of all, if you want to see the tape that's being made, it will be up on YouTube, but information will be at our website, so you can always go to our website, which is up here. We'll leave that up. I do want to thank Kieran. I'm not sure she's still here. Kieran Clayton for providing this wonderful space for us, and NOAA Commerce for that. I also want to thank the folks at SEJ for providing several speakers today, and particularly to thank our members, many of whom couldn't be here, who are on our organizing committee, particularly Lisa Song from Inside Climate News, and also Nancy Gardner from SEJ, who couldn't be here, and then Rear Admiral Gautier, who's now moved on to NSA, right? But it's work and response. And I also want to thank the agencies for their clarity, or their willingness to be here. So we have a tradition in the center, and that tradition is that everyone who's a speaker gets a bottle of New Hampshire maple syrup by one of my former students, won the 2013 Best Tasting Syrup Award in the state of New Hampshire.
I'll take Mark's, because he can't fly with it.
No, we'll ship it to Mark, who can't fly with it. So I do want to thank all of you, and please be in touch. Karen, you want to say something?
I just want to let everyone know how to get out of this building.
Oh, yeah.
I promise you it's better, it's easier than getting in. You're just going to go through these double glass doors that are here to my left, and you're going to follow the green exit signs. When you see the Department of Commerce daycare, don't go there. There's a big sign that says not an exit. You're literally going to follow the green exit signs, and it will drop you at 14th and Pennsylvania.
Okay, and if any of you are interested in continuing the dialogue, we will be at McCormick and Schmick's at F Street Northwest. So you walk towards 15th and Pennsylvania, and we'll be there at 6. So thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate it.
sense.